James John Herbert was born April 8, 1943 and died March 20, 2013, was an English horror writer, a full-time writer. He also designed his own book covers and publicity. His books have sold 54 million copies worldwide and have been translated into 34 languages, including Chinese and Russian. Born in London, Herbert was the son of Herbert Herbert, a stallholder at London's Brick Lane Market. He attended a Catholic school in Bethnal Green called Our Lady of the Assumption, then at 11 won a scholarship at St Aloysius Grammar School in Highgate. He left school at 15 and studied at the Hanse College of Art, joining the art department of John Collins, a small advertising agency. He left the agency to join Charles Barker Advertising, where he worked as an art director and then group head. I am Daniel Likis.
And I'm Craig Blay, and thank you for listening to Book 101.
Yes, because Book 101 Review is created to empower writers all over the world.
Yes, we are here on that mission. Our mission statement should be above the door somewhere.
And we are very excited for our first episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's cue. And cheers, and been so looking forward to this.
As we said, we're bringing out the goodness and the highlights of each writers all over the world.
We're talking about one of the legends of horror fiction, really, James Herbert. I've heard a lot of him already from myself and my brothers in Severed Arms. I usually call him Richard Eyre. You know, we're both very much fans and devotees. He's been very, very influential in our work. So yeah, really looking forward to sort of getting in and delving in and talking about him.
Yes, and Mr. Herbert, if you compare to the present day right now, can you compare to Mr. King?
That is a comparison which you can take every horror writer to Stephen King. I think Stephen King is attained the absolute pinnacle that the writer wants to aspires to now. I mean, the biggest difference for me, if you're going to compare the two, is it's down to personal taste. I very much a lover of Herbert. I haven't read all of his books. I read enough to know how inspirational I found them. I never really got along with Stephen King, if I'm honest. So there's an obvious difference there. I don't think you'll ever know, academically what the difference are, because I think everyone, as Richard had said as well, everyone reads and writes completely. We could take the same book and look at it 2 or 3 different ways. Me personally, I've said it before. He's a lot more direct in his language, his writing style. There's no fluff to it. If you know what I mean. He makes a point. If he's describing something, he describes it as it is, as you would see it. He doesn't need to take a paragraph to describe one thing, and I think that in itself creates an impact. If something terrible is happening, something great is happening, either way, if you're reading about it quickly, it's there. You've got no time to prepare for it. You've got no time to think about it. And that's what I found with the early books I read of his in particular. They all had an impact on me. There's certain parts of each book that stuck with me that then caused me to want to, unknowingly, really unconsciously, to weave that kind of thing into my own work, because I knew the effect it had on me, and it's a lasting effect. With just words, you can make such an impact. And I think with Stephen King, I think he does dance around the point a little bit. Sorry to all you Stephen King advocates out there. But you've got to compare the size of the books, just on the shelf. And Stephen King's is always like a tome. They're quite a lot of them are very, very big. I find that quite intimidating as a reader. Straight off. There's a Britishness to James Herbert as well. A lot of his books are set in Britain, which obviously I will relate to. They're all set in they start off in very, I wouldn't say mundane, everyday settings, everyday occurrences. It's just, I can't describe it. There is a British quality to them. I think that could be the fact that he's so direct. We the stiff lip and the typical stigma attached to being British. I think the dry sense of humor, you could definitely get that in there. I think that is all. Yeah, it all comes through in his writing style.
As a fan of James Herbert, what do you think the flaws of the writing of Mr. Herbert?
Flaws, did you say?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question to think about, isn't it? I do know, and this is one of the things that has put me off a few writers past a certain point, because I can delve into a particular writer and go back and want to read, especially someone with the size of back catalogue that James Herbert has. It can get a bit repetitive. He does to have in most of his books a bit of a blueprint, for how the story unfolds, certain things that happen. It's not, it's different things that happen, but in a certain order, in a certain way. And I think beyond a certain point, I started to see that made the books probably, if you're reading them one after the other, they get a little bit predictable. You can kind of see where the twists and that. He's renowned for his twists. There's always and this is again me saying this, there always seems to be a twist at the end. Maybe that in itself is a flaw because we come to expect it. I think it's just trying to step away from doing the norm on each book and sort of sticking to the same format, I suppose.
Yes, definitely. So as a writer of a horror, the Wildemore Apocalypse trilogy,
yes,
what characteristics that you inherit to Mr. Herbert?
Again, is that directness. I think I wanted that. I wanted there to, if there was like tragic events, blood and gore and all that horror books, when it came to putting those in my book, I didn't want them to be long drawn out, entire chapters spent on one thing that was happening. I wanted something to happen quickly with very little fanfare almost, and then move on as if whatever had happened, however horrific it is, it's been and gone. It's almost like you're living the scene. You're not not one moment won't last 15 pages, in life. As you experience it, it'll be here and gone, and you've got to kind of absorb that, move on. And I think I wanted people to experience that with my books and find them pacey. That's one thing about his books. They don't really lag too often. The story does keep a pace, and I wanted that. I didn't want any stagnant parts of my books. And this real ominous kind of feeling over the setting that he has and what is going on, and it's the uncertainty and where you become unnerved as a reader, sort of reading what's going to happen. You want to know what happens next, but you're almost too frightened to know in a way, because it could be anything. I wanted that kind of suspense, that uncomfortable feeling. I think I might have said that before when books, and it seems an odd thing for someone to want to evoke in a reader or a fan, but I think in reading, especially horror books, comfortable, then you know that you're reading something that is an emotional impact on you. So trying to package all that together, really, I don't know how successfully I did, but that's what I was aiming for.
So which book of Mr. Herbert influenced you the best?
Oh, wow. So there's a couple of them, really. So the way I discovered James Herbert will never let me forget, because she was a reader when I met her, and I wasn't. I didn't have the patience for reading. It was her parents actually that bought. Sounds bad. They bought me my first novel, my first proper book, when I went just after I first met them. It wasn't Herbert. This was my wife Marie, who she was kept trying to imposed on me The Others, which is one of James Herbert's books, and I looked at it and this ghostly cover and everything. It looked impressive and inviting, but I think it was probably easily 6-7 years of her gently kind of saying, you should try this, and I didn't. And then I picked it up once because I think I decided I wanted to get into more reading, and I didn't have nothing inspiring was jumping out at me, so I decided to pick it up, and that hasn't happened very often with me. And it's the first I used to read before I started writing. I used to read on my lunch break at work while I was in my car, and I parked probably about a mile away from where I worked, and this was the first where I got so close to the end that I couldn't put it down. I needed to know what happened. I read it as I walked back to work. So I was crossing streets and roads and everything, reading, because I had to know what happened. And I think it was these twists. It was the fact that sometimes you forget you're reading a horror because he draws on a lot of everyday life within his books, but these sort of paranormal, supernatural, horrific things are happening intertwined with that. And when you get towards the end and like the big climax, he has a fantastic way of making you think you know what's going to happen, and then actually someone like, no, actually we're going in this direction, and then ends the book, and you are left with a feeling of you can't do that to me. You've built this up. You've made me go in another direction. You've confused the hell out of me, and now you're saying that's it. I want more. The Others was the first one to do that. It remained my favourite for quite a while until I discovered The Ghosts of Sleeth. It was a book I think my mum bought. It's called a yard sale, boot sale. We call them, just like people go and just sell all the stuff they don't want anymore. And she picked me up a load of horror books because I was massively into it. And Ghosts of Sleeth was in there. Again, it was one that remained on the before I picked it up. And this one, not only could I not down, it's one of those endings. It was heart-wrenching for me. It was again this twist that I didn't see coming, and it involved one of the main characters, or the main character called David Ash. He is a bit unlucky in love. It does seem to be a case that if he meets a woman along his travels, that something bad does happen to most of them. And you didn't see it was all going to be happy endings, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. And it was that one. It was the language he used in one particular scene at the end. I've got it here, actually. If, with your permission, the reader.
Definitely.
This is the passage that stuck with me, and I'll read a couple of. It's the language he used, which is exactly what I was getting at in terms of his directness. So, go for this one actually. So, lightning deluged the great hall, and saw Grace standing quite still among the debris. She appeared to be frozen there, her arms glistening in the light, her breasts bloody and raw protrusions, her eyes white against the dark, jellied meat of her skinless face. It's
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I was kind of left with. And I was like, that's whenever I talk about his directness, it's like he is describing to you in a poetic way what you're seeing, and what you're seeing is horrific. He's not going to fluff it up. He's going to tell you exactly what you're seeing. And when I came to writing my own scenes like that, it wasn't just World War Apocalypse, actually. I did it a bit in Necessary End as well. I wanted that kind of description, not word for word, obviously, but that kind of detail, but not linearly. It's a passing comment, and then you're gone. And it just leaves you thinking, oh, I didn't need to know that.
I have a goosebump while you're reading the sentence.
There you go. Ghost of Sleeth, definitely one. Anyone not read it, go read it. It's fantastic.
So let's listen to Mr. Richard Eyre, what we're going to talk about. Mr. James. So why James Herbert influence you in your writing?
You know what? I think it's because of a lot of things. I think I've talked about this before, and I think certainly the first book I ever read by James Herbert, the first book I came across, because I'd never heard of him, was Lair, which was the sequel to The Rats. But I hadn't heard of The Rats, and I hadn't heard of anything by James Herbert. And so I read Lair, and I loved it. There was just yeah, I don't know if you've read Lair, but Lair is set in is it the New Forest or Epping Forest or somewhere? I can't remember where it is. Some forest. It's been a long time since I read it, and these giant mutant murderous rats are in the forest. And obviously the book is a sequel, but it was another thing that was quite good about this is and once I read Lair, I then went and I basically just started reading James Herbert from the very first book. So after Lair, I read Rats, which is a sort of backwards way of doing it. But then I read the the Fog, and I tried to read them in order of publication. And what I quite liked about the Rats trilogy is that it's different people. It's not the same characters in each book. They're completely different, unless you class the rats themselves as the same characters. But they're different characters. You know, you've got you got Harrison, the first book, who is a teacher. Then you've got Luke. Luke Pender, is it? I can't remember his name. It's years since I read it. And then you've got the other guy, the helicopter pilot in Domain, which was the third of the Rats trilogy. I believe there's a graphic novel as well called The City, which is which is set after Domain. But I've never read that one either. But there was just something about James Herbert's writing that appealed to me, even though he is from the south. He's from London. He's from a pretty poor background. I have read a couple of biographies of James Herbert. He's from a very very, very poor background. There's just something about the Englishness, the Britishness of James Herbert that appeals to me. And I like the way it's not like a haunted house. There are haunted house books that he's written, the Ash books, I suppose, but things happen on a sunny day. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Where you don't expect bad things to happen or supernatural things to happen. And I quite like that. I quite like the idea of it's quite shocking that somebody can be wandering around in a nice forest on a lovely sunny afternoon and then get ripped apart by mutant rats. You know?
Yes. So if you describe the writing of Mr. James Herbert, what is it?
I would describe it as immersive, quite fast paced. Most of his books are quite fast paced, and like a lot of people, his writing got better as he went on. You know, his ability to describe and things like that. I think the Rats and Lair, certainly the Rats and the Fog, the early books that he was writing in the sort of mid-70s maybe, are pulp. You can sort of call them pulp horror in a way, but I always thought James Herbert was a bit of a standout to other writers that were doing the same sort of thing at the time. But it became quite polished as time went on. And I also like the way that he started to change his genres. He didn't always just stick to horror, because he wrote books like Fluke, which was quite a I don't know what you would describe it. It's a fantasy book, isn't it? But also things like Nobody True, which to me is one of my favorite James Herbert books. Nobody True. I just think it's such a clever idea, and you could have gone anywhere with it. And I like the way that book sort of progresses and how that works. You know, although obviously there is quite a horror element in it with the murderer who's around there. I would just describe his writing as immersive, as to the point. You know, there's not a lot of messing around. He gets into the story. Strangely enough, I've just started rereading 48. The first, I reckon, if I remember correctly, I'm up to about chapter 3 now. But I reckon about the first 4 chapters is just like one big long chase sequence, you know. So it's straight into it, and that's what I liked about James Herbert's writing. Whether he's writing really visceral horror and blood and guts and stuff, or he's talking about things that are are slightly different and being a bit more descriptive. I think it works on two. It works on a lot of different levels, you know.
So do you think Mr. James Herbert is one of the legendary writer?
Yeah, I absolutely do, and I don't think he ever got the not the fame so much, what the sort of critical
The crowd.
Yeah, I think he had a big, you know, I think he obviously sold lots and lots of books, but I don't think he was ever thought of in the same way as a sort of Stephen King and people like that. And I think he should have been, because I think he's often, I've heard him describe, other people have, I don't think he described himself as this, but other people have described him as the English Stephen King, you know.
Yes.
But he's not. He's a very different writer.
Mr. James Herbert is one of the foundation of horror genre.
Oh, definitely, and certainly British horror. You know, because when I started reading James Herbert, I was reading things like the sort of what have now become known as the sort of horror classics, like The Exorcist, and you know, and Stephen King stuff as well. But yeah, and I just think James Herbert is definitely up there in, certainly for me. I mean, you know, writing is different for everybody, and reading, people will read different things and like different things, and that's I can do that. I read very different books, you know, but I think, like music, we were talking last week about music, and I was saying to you, you know, I think the music you get into at a certain age, and that age is probably about 13, 14, 15, maybe, for me, but a bit younger, 12, 13, 14. And that, what it said to me then at the time, still, there's sort of ghostly remnants that still do that now as a man in my 50s now, you know. And it's the same as, I think, you're reading. I think if a book, and I would argue that this book was the first book that really dragged me into a story, and I was just, oh my God, what's going to happen next? It was exciting, you know. The Lair, when I first read Lair, got into James Herbert a very similar way as I got into Iron Maiden and Michael Schenker and Kiss and music like that, you know. I wanted to read all of his books. I wanted to get all of his books and read all of his books, and they rarely disappointed. One or two didn't quite hit the mark for me, but most of them did. Certainly Minstrel's Bargain that I wrote and Point of Contact are very Herbert-esque, and people have said this. You know, they've said there's similar. I mean, and I've said this before. I'm not in any way saying I'm anywhere near his skill level, but a similar sort of. I don't know, Britishness, a similar writing style of having little vignettes of things that are happening to one side that are to do with the story, but not the central story itself. You sort of take a step away and describe something that's going on. A good example of that for James Herbert is Domain, where you've got the central story of these survivors of the nuclear attack on London, and their story of survival. But you've also got little vignettes of people who survived outside, you know, and what happened to them, and it's the real sort of horror of what a nuclear war would be like, you know. So there's almost two different things going on at the same time, but they're sort of connected, you know.
Yes.
And I think I was doing that, certainly with Minstrel's Bargain and certainly with Point of Contact. And I suppose with the two other sequels to Minstrel's Bargain, I kept to the same system. Is that it? I don't know. It's just the way, because I'd read so many James Herbert books, that's what I thought a good horror thriller book was. So I basically just sort of subconsciously, I think, sort of copied them. And I've done that in most of my books. I think even in Shadow of the Knife, which is a you know, a crime thriller. There's no horror, there's no science fiction or sort of supernatural horror in that at all. But there are still little vignettes that are put into that one. The only book I haven't really done that with is A Life Eternal, but that's because it's written firsthand. It's written first person, so you can't really say what's happening somewhere else when you're just describing the book through some one person's eyes. And the only book that I think, I might be wrong, but I think the only book that James Herbert did that, no, it probably wasn't. Certainly did it with Nobody True, but maybe books like The Magic Cottage as well, and perhaps Once, where it doesn't really cut away to different things that are happening outside the main thread of the story.
Mr. Richards said that the writing of Mr. Herbert influenced him through immersiveness and fast pace. Is it the same to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, that what I was saying before about the pace of it, and that I wanted in my own work, because it's very easy to pick up a book. It starts off really well and then it doesn't seem to go anywhere. And rather than suffer, I am one of those. Again, shoot me if anyone out there disagrees with what I do, but I will put a book down and I'll abandon it. I kind of think life's too short to be reading bad books. So yeah, I think and the immersiveness, yes, absolutely. That is, you do feel like you are living through whatever, whatever. He's so fantastic at painting the scene very simply that you can almost see and smell and feel everything that he's describing, and which again adds to the tension and the discomfort when the bad things start happening, because you do feel there. I think cliche, but a good book, a good writer will do that to you. Absolutely.
Yes, definitely. And Mr. Richard said that comparing to Mr. King, being famous is not that attained. What do you think? What the factor? Why Mr. Herbert is not famous as like Mr. King?
I would love to be able to answer that. No, because then we can write that wrong. And make sure. The thing is, he is. I mean, I think nowadays he's one of those who is like not time, but become a legend outside of it. Because I think modern day horror writers, especially here in the UK, all credit James Herbert in one way or another. So I mean, outside of the UK, I don't. I mean, I maybe some people thought Stephen King was the epitome of what horror should be, and then everyone else was compared to that. And I think there are differences, like Richard said, there are differences between them. They're not the same. James Herbert, maybe because of his directness, his Britishness, maybe was more of an acquired taste, found himself pigeonholed just by who he was and what he, how he wrote about stuff, not necessarily what he wrote about, but how he did it. And you get people on both sides of the fence. You get ones who swear by Stephen King, and you get ones like me who would. I mean, a lot of other writers have influenced me, but James Herbert, I will always go back to, who really got the gears going for me. And we don't seem to agree. I think you are either one or the other for some bizarre reason. Mainstream wise, I think obviously Stephen King got a couple of his books made into major films, which obviously helps get you that recognition, especially when they release the films as in Stephen King's It or whatever. Immediately your name is everywhere. And to my recollection, I know there's been a couple of movie adaptations and a couple of sort of TV miniseries adaptations of James Herbert's books, but nowhere near as much. There's not been a big Hollywood, release based on one of his books that I'm aware of. And again, I think it's mainly sort of champion his stuff, and the ones that are putting it on screen, I think, are British-made ones. So, yeah, I think Hollywood found Stephen King. Maybe that's the difference. Don't know. I'll go with that.
Yes, because most of the books went to the motion pictures, so everybody knows. I think in terms of writing or how they portray the stories in horror genre, they are equal. Yeah. And talking about the film adaptation, I think Rats was adapted as a motion picture in 1982 called Deadly Eyes.
There we go then. And then they probably didn't credit him. It wasn't in the title. James Herbert's Deadly Eyes, probably.
Yes.
It does, or it's everyone knows rats. If you hear about James Herbert, one of the first 3 or 5 books that come to mind that I'll always talk about is rats. And there you go, prime example. They took it, but they changed the name immediately. You're taking away permission.
True.
Extenuating circumstances, I can understand why they may choose to change it, but I think, yeah, if you are taking a book, unless you are rewriting it and you're just taking elements of it, if you are basing mostly on the book, it deserves to have that title. The writer, I'm always going to say the writer deserves recognition as the filmmaker. Absolutely. Had another one, again, another writer we'll talk about down the line. One of my favorites is a guy called Steve Alton, and he again, well known in for the books he's done. Only really came to the fore a few years ago when The Meg was released. It was made into a monster motion picture and released. I think it was 2018. And I'm a massive fan. I was waiting for this. First of all, they changed it. The book is called Meg, but the film is called The Meg. But again, for me, it's like you may not associate the two. And that is a prime example, if we ever talk about this again, of Hollywood changing a story for the worse, I would say. It's they leave some things well alone, but I digress.
Yes, I watched already the movie Meg, and oh wow.
It's great. Absolutely.
It's great, yes. One of a kind.
Yes.
So it so happened that Mr. James Herbert is mislabeled, and in terms of works, is one of a kind and phenomenal, people.
Absolutely. For me, I think there's people out there. Everyone's got opinions, but I would happily have a long discussion, a long debate over certainly James Herbert's contribution to horror. People out there who don't think he's contributed or he's one of the top dogs. I'll happily argue with you on that one.
So do you think Mr. James Herbert is the top 5 legendary contributor of horror genre?
Absolutely, without question. Yes, I do.
Or probably the top 1, yeah?
Hey, again, there are others that I can credit with particularly shaping the way not the way I write, but the way I read as well. It's that sort of on and read. James Herbert isn't only one, but he's the one that really, I was a horror fan before, but he was the one that really pulled me into, rather than playing and watching horror, you need to be reading it as well. I've really not looked back from there. He was the one that started it all. Yeah. So.
Yes. And let's talk about his first novel, The Rats.
Yes, let's.
It was published in 1974, and as I said, a film adaptation in 1982 called Deadly Eyes. So happened that they followed the movie title. It's probably they give credit to Mr. James Herbert. And there's a sequel for this book. It's called Lair in 1979. Domain in 1984, and The City in 1993. And they said it's very well received, people.
It is, yeah. It's the one I think I possibly had heard of Rats before I heard of James Herbert, which is odd. I kind of knew that this book was out there, but I never put 2 and 2 together until I started reading his stuff. And I was like, once I'd read those and Ghosts of Sleeth, and I was like, oh wow, this is the guy who's done that. And I immediately had to go and find it. And I've always been a massive fan of big horror, monster movies and books. If there's a big monster or a gigantic thing, I'll always be drawn to it. So who doesn't like a mutant rat, let alone an army? So
the version of King Kong, people.
There you go. Absolutely. And it could only happen. It's Epping Forest. So there we go. That was Richard was trying to remember what it was. Epping and you're going to base it in a city. It goes back to like days of the plague, when they were blaming the Black Death and everything in London. So it kind of brings you to that. It's like, this is the next mutation.
Yes, I think Mr. Herbert got that idea because of the bubonic plague. I think, right?
Yeah.
And if United States have King Kong, the United Kingdom have rats.
There you go. Hey, Hollywood's out there. There's a crossover
Yes.
and sort of there.
You miss it out, people. That's how Mr. Herbert, genius. Come on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the second novel, titled The Fog, it was published in 1975. I think it's a follow-up novel of Mr. Herbert about a deadly fog that drive its victims insane when they come into a contact with it.
Classic horror. This was really. I love the 70s and the 80s for this is where the genesis of these ideas you're still seeing come around now. I think all began. The Fog isn't one of the books I've actually read, funnily enough, probably because I think I know quite a lot about it because I realized till recently actually the John Carpenter film The Fog is not linked to it, not connected to it. But immediately he's got that, you kind of think, okay, yeah, I know the premise and what happens, whatever, and it's I've never been drawn to it. But even up to now, a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if it's a series that's available over there, Daniel, but on Amazon Prime they released a new Prime exclusive series called The Rig. Yeah, so in the first episode you get to see this ominous force. You find out obviously towards the end of the series what it actually is, but it appears as a fog rolling across the sea, and it affects you as it envelopes you. Guys are out on the oil rigs. As soon as it passes by and you're caught in it, weird things start to happen. And my wife and I made the comment then, this must be, it looks like something James Herbert wrote.
Yes.
Yeah, which immediately pulled us in. Again, that association with him, even though I'm not familiar with the book itself, that association of that book meant, okay, yeah, I'll give this a go, because if it is that way inclined, it's going to be good.
Yes, I think so, because I watched that last week and then yes, it's associated with the
it
fog.
is very. It doesn't quite go. I mean, seeing I've read up on what James Herbert's Fog is actually about and kind of what happens, but it doesn't follow that same path. It is different to that, but it's got that
element
feel to it. I think James Herbert has left behind, if nothing else, a legacy of what some horror fans base other things on. He's not around to enjoy that.
It's not credited. There's a lot of authors out there that their work hard. Their work is so big, but they are not credited.
No, and it always tends to happen. Leftist. What's going to happen to mine? You never know.
No, that's supposed to be. But that's why I created this podcast to empower writers all over the world.
There we go. I was going to say maybe that would happen, but actually because of this podcast, hopefully not. So
yes, hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
And let's talk about the 1976 third novel of Mr. Herbert, The Survivor. It is the third novel by Mr. Herbert and a second not part of the wider series. It was the basis of the 1981 movie of the same name. Oh, wow. Cool. Good to know, right?
There you go. So there is one out there. Unfortunately, when I was, again, work that I wasn't as familiar with, except for rats, obviously. So the Fog I mentioned, I haven't gone back and read that. Survivor I hadn't even heard of. How bad is that? So it's great that there was an adaptation of it. I from what I can see, it wasn't fantastically well received, unfortunately. And I found just along my travels, I found a review that someone wrote of Survivor, which I thought was quite interesting, considering what what Richard Eyre as well has said about his writing style, how much we love it. I'll just read a little clip from here. But basically, what they were saying is that they referenced another book a horror book that the plot was great, but it wasn't, the language wasn't direct enough. A bit like, what I've said about Stephen King. And what they've said about this one is the plot for The Survivor is very basic. But this is a book, it's a book that didn't, what something simple to the point, and this one wasn't it. So the plot line is basic enough; it should have done it, but James Herbert, he wasn't directed enough with how he wrote it, and it was a bit too ready. So I was like, that's very odd considering what we think of the rest of his stuff. You know, I know it's only one person's opinion, but if that's, you know, maybe it wasn't one of his best ones. I'm not sure.
Or probably the director or the screenwriter did not translate very well.
Other thing, I mean, this is what is dangerous, and I've always done it where again, not much. I haven't been much of a reader for much of my life, really, considering. I always find it easier to watch the film because, you know, that can be done in 2 hours, whereas a book would take me probably a couple of weeks sometimes. But my wife is very much the other way around, and she'd always say, you need to read the book. There is so much they've missed out, crucial stuff. You know, this made more sense in the book. So it's a fine line to tread, that one. There's very few films out there, I think, that have done the books justice, unfortunately.
Yes, definitely. So, Mr. Chris, let's do the recap of Mr. James Herbert work of writings. What are the adjectives?
The adjectives, again, to borrow one of Richard's, I mean, it's definitely immersive. You do very much get straight into the story. It is pacey if you don't want one that is, you know, drags on and on and on, like certain authors remain nameless to do. They're chilling. I always have that sense of foreboding with his stuff. There always seems to be a bit of a about them. Not necessarily, you know, even if it's broad daylight outside and it's glorious sunshine in the middle of summer, like again, the what Richard said in his bit about rats, these horrible things happen time. He's unconventional, I would say, because sometimes it's not what you'd expect from horror. It's pulp horror, but the settings he uses, the twists and turns, you're always left guessing, left feeling a little bit uncomfortable, which, hey, why not? You know, that's what makes it all fantastic. Horror fantastic.
Yes, people support James Herbert, even he's no longer around us. A legendary horror writer.
He's actually been recognized as well. There is a horror writing prize called the James Herbert Award for horror writers.
Here we go, people. One of a kind. Let's support Mr. Herbert for the generation to come, because of the work of Mr. Herbert is one of a kind, and most of the authors nowadays they considered him as an idol. By some people, even is that. So, Mr. Chris, promote your book every time we discuss it. Promote your book.
People are either going to get sick of me or they're going to go and buy them. I know which one I prefer. So yeah, you can find me if you've got Amazon. Just punch my name in, Chris Tetroplay. You'll find on there my horror works, which include my Wilderness. So that is Acolyte, The Sowing Season, and be released again of Gods and Insects. And A Necessary End, which I would say if I'm going to hang my hat on my personal favourite of my horror stuff, that would probably be... I would always direct people to A Necessary End, mainly because my trilogy is incomplete. But if you want a taste of my sort of style and my work and the influence of people like James Herbert, go and dig out A Necessary End, which you can also find not only in ebook form, but it's out there in audiobook form as well. And for anyone who likes a lighter side of life, or those horror fans who have got children need to put to bed at night, I've also got 2 children's picture books out there. It's Night for Santa, which I believe you can still find again on Amazon. So yeah, enjoy, and let me know what you think as well. You know, you find obviously Daniel on social media. And if you listen to this and you've read anything of mine, please do let me know what you think.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Chris, because if you read one of the readers' comments, it will haunt you with the rest of your life.
If you don't buy them, I will. So,
yes. So let them buy, people.
More to come, people.
See you soon.